The mountain air tasted clean and cold that October morning in 2010, the kind of air that makes your lungs feel new. 6 friends stood in the parking lot of the Cascade Ridge trailhead in Oregon, loading their packs with supplies for what should have been a simple 3-day hiking trip. They'd done this route before, 17 miles through pine forests and alpine meadows, ending at Mirror Lake, where they'd camp under the stars. Jason Rivera, 34, a high school teacher from Portland, was organizing the group as usual. His girlfriend Amanda Torres, 31, a veterinary nurse, was double-checking their first aid kit. The other 4 were longtime friends. Marcus Webb, 36, who owned a small construction business. His wife Linda, 33, a librarian. Kyle Patterson, 29, a graphic designer. And Nicole Grant, 30, who worked at a non-profit downtown. They'd been hiking together for 5 years, every autumn without fail. Before we continue with what happened to these 6 people, I'd love to hear from you. Please subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get back to this mystery that haunted investigators for over a decade. The weather forecast looked perfect. Clear skies, temperatures in the low 60s, no chance of rain. Jason had filed their itinerary with the ranger station, marking their planned campsites and expected return date of October 17th. Everything was routine, practiced, safe. They waved to another group of hikers heading up a different trail, shouldered their packs, and disappeared into the forest at 8:47 a.m. When they didn't return by October 18th, Amanda's sister called the authorities. Search and rescue teams deployed immediately, combing the 17-mile trail and surrounding areas. They found the first campsite exactly where Jason had marked it. With evidence, the group had stayed there the first night. A fire ring with cold ashes, some boot prints, a granola bar wrapper that Marcus's wife had been eating. But after that first campsite, the trail went cold in the most literal sense. No second campsite, no abandoned gear, no signs of injury or struggle. The search expanded to 70 square miles, involving helicopters, search dogs, and over 200 volunteers. For 3 weeks, they found nothing. It was as if 6 experienced hikers had simply evaporated into the mountain air. The families refused to believe they were gone. Amanda's sister Elena became the public face of the search, appearing on local news stations with photographs of the missing 6, begging anyone who'd seen anything to come forward. Jason's mother organized volunteer searches every weekend for months. Marcus's construction crew put up missing person posters across 3 counties. The community rallied, donated money for extended searches, held candlelight vigils. But autumn turned to winter, and winter buried the mountains under 8 feet of snow, and the official search was suspended. Theories proliferated like wildfire. Some believed the group had gotten lost and died of exposure in some hidden ravine. Others whispered about a serial killer operating in the national forests. There had been 2 unsolved disappearances in Washington state the year before. Conspiracy theorists suggested witness protection or voluntary disappearance, though anyone who knew these people dismissed that immediately. They had jobs, families, lives they loved. Marcus and Linda had a daughter, Emma, who was 7 years old when her parents vanished. She drew pictures of them every single day. Detective Frank Holloway from the county sheriff's office spent 3 years working the case, even after it officially went cold. He interviewed everyone who'd been on the mountain that weekend, reviewed cell phone records. All 6 phones had lost signal around the same area, which was normal for that elevation, and analyzed weather patterns, wildlife activity, geological surveys. He found nothing that explained how 6 people could vanish so completely. Years passed. The families held memorial services without bodies. Emma grew up with photographs of parents she barely remembered. Kyle's father died of a heart attack, and everyone said it was really a broken heart. Nicole's mother developed early-onset dementia, and in her confused moments, she'd ask when Nicole was coming home for dinner. The community never forgot. Every October, They'd hold a remembrance walk along the first 3 miles of that trail, but slowly, painfully, life moved forward. Then came October 2023, 13 years after the disappearance. A tourist from California named David Brennan was visiting Oregon with his new drone, one of those high-end models with 4K cameras and extended range. He'd been flying it over the Cascade region, capturing footage for his travel blog, focusing on areas most tourists never saw. He was particularly interested in remote locations, places where nature remained untouched and wild. On October 9th, David launched his drone from a ridge about 9 miles northeast of where the hiking group had last been seen. He was filming a series of ancient rock formations, dramatic cliffs that looked like something from another planet. The drone climbed higher, panning across a landscape of granite and pine, when something in the footage caught his eye. At first, it looked like debris, maybe an old hunting cabin or abandoned mining equipment, but when David zoomed in and adjusted the camera angle, his blood went cold. Visible through a thick canopy of trees, barely discernible in the shadows, were the weathered remains of what appeared to be camping tents. And nearby, arranged in a way that couldn't be natural, were 6 backpacks hanging from tree branches, suspended 10 feet off the ground. David immediately contacted the county sheriff's office. Within hours, a recovery team was hiking toward the coordinates. The location was in a narrow canyon that wasn't on any official trail map, accessible only by descending a treacherous 40-foot cliff face that had partially collapsed. No wonder searchers had missed it. From ground level, the canyon was invisible, hidden behind rock formations and dense forest. You'd have to know exactly where to look, and even then, you'd need climbing gear to reach it. When the team finally made it down into the canyon, what they found defied every theory anyone had constructed over 13 years. The camp was elaborate, carefully constructed, with a large central area where the tents had been pitched. The 6 backpacks hung from branches, protected from animals, still containing supplies, water filters, cooking equipment, extra clothing. A fire ring sat in the middle of the camp, and nearby, carved into a flat section of rock, were 6 names and 6 dates. But there were no remains, no bodies, no bones, no sign of what had happened to the 6 hikers after they'd made this camp. The camp's location raised immediate questions. Why had experienced hikers left the marked trail to descend into an unmapped canyon? The detective who'd replaced Holloway after his retirement, a woman named Rebecca Torres, no relation to Amanda, studied the scene for hours. She noticed something strange about the way the camp was arranged. Everything was organized, methodical, as if they'd planned to stay there for an extended period. Then they found the journals. Sealed in waterproof bags and tucked into one of the suspended backpacks were 3 journals belonging to Jason, Amanda, and Linda. The entries told a story that nobody could have predicted. On their second day of hiking, October 14th, the group had encountered another hiker, a man in his 50s who'd seemed disoriented and injured. He'd told them about a shortcut to Mirror Lake, a route that would save them 5 miles and offer spectacular views that few people ever saw. Marcus had been skeptical, but the man had shown them a hand-drawn map, detailed and convincing. He'd claimed to be a retired park ranger who'd hiked these mountains for 30 years. Jason's journal entry from that day reflected their debate. Half the group wanted to stick to the marked trail, but the injured man had been persuasive, and ultimately they'd agreed to help him reach his truck, which he said was parked near the shortcut's exit point. The journal entries grew more troubling. By the afternoon of October 14th, they'd realized the shortcut wasn't leading toward Mirror Lake at all. The man had disappeared while they were setting up camp. Linda's journal mentioned he'd gone to scout ahead and never returned. By nightfall, they understood they were lost. Jason's journal entry was remarkably calm, noting that they had supplies for several more days and would begin trying to find their way back to the main trail at first light. October 15th. They'd tried to climb out of the canyon, but found the cliff face too dangerous to scale without proper equipment. Kyle had nearly fallen, saved only by Marcus grabbing his jacket. They decided to stay put and wait for rescue. They knew people would be looking for them soon. October 16th. Spirits were still relatively high. They'd rationed their food and water. Nicole had organized games to keep everyone calm. Amanda wrote about Emma, Marcus and Linda's daughter, and how they couldn't wait to see her again. October 17th. The entries became shorter, more worried. Their food was running low. They'd tried signaling with mirrors and whistles, but the canyon walls seemed to swallow sound. Jason wrote about feeling foolish for trusting a stranger, for leaving the marked trail. The final entry was dated October 20th, written in Jason's increasingly shaky handwriting, "Water almost gone. We hear helicopters, but they can't see us through the trees. We've hung our packs high to protect from animals. If anyone finds this, we tried. Tell our families we love them. Tell them we never stopped fighting." And then, nothing. The canyon had been searched extensively after the discovery, but no human remains were ever found. The journals ended, but the story continued in invisible ink. Detective Torres brought in forensic anthropologists, geologists, and search specialists. They spent weeks in that canyon, sifting through soil, exploring every crevice, searching for any sign of what happened after October 20th. What they discovered was a complex network of narrow fissures in the canyon floor, some barely visible beneath 13 years of accumulated debris and vegetation. Ground-penetrating radar revealed that these fissures connected to a series of underground caverns, partially collapsed and extremely unstable. The geologist explained that the area was prone to localized earthquakes. There had been a small tremor recorded on October 21, 2010, centered less than 3 miles from the canyon. The working theory emerged slowly, painfully. After the group's final journal entry, possibly while searching for a way out or trying to collect water from a stream they'd mentioned finding, one or more members of the group had fallen through a fissure into the underground cavern system. The others would have tried to rescue them. The tremor on October 21st might have caused a collapse, sealing the caverns and everyone inside them. It was a theory, not a certainty. The caverns were too unstable to safely explore. 2 structural engineers declared them at risk of catastrophic collapse. The families were faced with an impossible choice: demand further excavation and risk more lives, or accept that their loved one's final resting place would remain sealed beneath the earth. They chose to let them rest. In November 2023, a memorial was erected at the canyon's rim, accessible by a newly cut trail. 6 bronze plaques bear the names and faces of the lost hikers. Emma, now 20 years old and studying environmental science, spoke at the dedication ceremony. She'd been too young to remember her parents clearly, but she'd grown up with their story, and now she finally had answers, however incomplete. "They didn't give up," she said, her voice steady despite tears. "They fought to come home, they fought for each other. And even though they didn't make it, even though we'll never hold them again, we know they loved us. We know they tried." The man who led them off the trail was never identified. Investigators combed through missing person reports and known con artists who operated in wilderness areas, but found no matches. He remained a ghost, a question mark in a story that had finally found most of its punctuation. David Brennan, the tourist whose drone footage had solved the 13-year mystery, attended the memorial service. He'd stopped flying his drone recreationally after that day. The weight of what he'd found had changed something in him. But the families thanked him, hugged him, told him he'd given them something precious: closure, context, the ability to finally grieve properly. Frank Holloway, the original detective, now 73 and long retired, stood at the memorial with tears streaming down his weathered face. For 3 years he'd searched for these people, and the answer had been there all along, hidden in a canyon that couldn't be seen from the ground, under trees too thick for helicopters to penetrate. He'd done everything right, But sometimes everything right isn't enough. The Cascade Ridge Trail remains popular with hikers, but now there are additional signs warning about leaving marked paths, about trusting strangers in the wilderness, about the mountain's hidden dangers. The ranger station keeps a logbook where visitors can read about the disappeared hikers, a reminder that nature is beautiful and indifferent, that preparation and experience don't guarantee safety, that sometimes the difference between coming home and vanishing forever is a single bad decision made with good intentions. Every October, on the anniversary of their disappearance, the families and friends gather at the memorial. They tell stories, share photographs, and hike the first 3 miles of the trail together, as far as the group made it before their journey went wrong. Emma brings flowers, 6 bouquets, 1 for each. She's become an advocate for wilderness safety, giving talks at outdoor recreation groups about the importance of staying on marked trails and never hiking alone with strangers. The journals were eventually returned to the families after forensic analysis. They're kept together in a secure location, a time capsule of those final days, evidence of courage and love in the face of death. Jason's mother, now 86, reads them sometimes, finding comfort in her son's words, in knowing that even at the end, he was thinking of the people he loved. The mountain keeps its dead. The canyon remains sealed, a natural tomb that no one will disturb. Sometimes, hikers report seeing lights in that area at night, or hearing voices carried on the wind, but these are probably just tricks of perception, the mind trying to make sense of absence. The 6 friends who went into the woods in October 2010 never came out, but their story finally did, carried on drone footage that revealed what armies of searchers couldn't find. In the end, they were only 9 miles from where they'd last been seen. Close enough that rescue should have been simple, but 9 miles in the wilderness can be the distance between Earth and stars, between life and death, between finding your way home and becoming another unsolved mystery that haunts a mountain forever. Except this mystery was solved, after 13 years of silence, by a tourist with a camera that could fly. Sometimes answers come not from searching harder, but from searching differently, from seeing the landscape from angles that human eyes alone could never reach. The families finally had their truth, incomplete but real, and in the knowing, they found a kind of peace that had eluded them for over a decade. The mountain stands unchanged, indifferent, beautiful and deadly as it's always been. And somewhere beneath its surface, in collapsed caverns that will never again see daylight, 6 friends rest together, just as they lived, side by side, refusing to give up on each other, even at the very end. The discovery of the canyon camp and the journals didn't just provide closure, it opened new wounds and raised questions that would haunt investigators for years to come. Detective Rebecca Torres found herself unable to let go of certain details that didn't quite fit the neat theory of accidental death by cave collapse. The mysterious man who'd led the group astray became her obsession. She spent months reviewing old case files, cross-referencing unsolved disappearances in wilderness areas across the Pacific Northwest. What she found disturbed her deeply enough that she requested a special task force be assembled in early 2024. There had been 17 similar cases over a 15-year period, stretching from Northern California to British Columbia. Experienced hikers who'd left marked trails, often after encounters with helpful strangers offering shortcuts or assistance. Most were never found. 3 cases had bodies recovered in remote locations, deaths ruled as accidental exposure or falls, but always with inconsistencies that bothered the investigating officers. Missing supplies, strange camp arrangements, evidence of having traveled much farther off-trail than made logical sense. Torres presented her findings to the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit in March 2024. Special Agent Catherine Reeves took the case, bringing with her 2 decades of experience hunting predators who operated in remote areas. Together, they built a profile of someone who knew the wilderness intimately, who understood how to exploit both the landscape and human psychology, who had been operating undetected for years. "He's not killing them directly," Reeves explained during a press conference that spring. "He's creating situations where the wilderness does the work for him. He's a facilitator of tragedy, not a traditional murderer, which is why he's evaded detection for so long." The press conference generated hundreds of tips. People remembered strange encounters on trails, helpful men who'd seemed slightly off, offered routes that felt wrong, but the descriptions varied wildly. Sometimes the man was in his 50s with a beard, sometimes clean-shaven and younger, sometimes wearing ranger uniforms, sometimes civilian hiking gear. Either there were multiple people involved, or this person was exceptionally good at altering his appearance. Emma attended every press conference, sat through every briefing. At 21, she'd become the unofficial spokesperson for the victims' families, articulate and passionate in demanding justice. She'd started a podcast called Lost on the Trail that investigated cold cases of missing hikers, and it had garnered over 2 million downloads. Her episode about her parents' case went viral, bringing national attention to Torres's investigation. In July 2024, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A retired postal worker named Gerald Hammond in Bend, Oregon, contacted Torres after seeing Emma's podcast. 15 years earlier, in 2009, he'd been hiking alone near the Three Sisters Wilderness when he'd encountered a man matching one of the descriptions, mid-50s, weathered face, claiming to be a retired ranger. The man had tried to convince Gerald to explore an amazing hidden waterfall that required leaving the trail. Something about the interaction had felt wrong to Gerald. The man had been too insistent, too familiar, touching Gerald's shoulder in a way that felt invasive. Gerald had politely declined and hiked on, but the encounter had stuck with him. He'd even written about it in his hiking journal, which he still kept. More importantly, he'd taken a photograph, just a scenic shot of the mountain vista, but visible in the background, slightly out of focus, was the man's face. The photograph was grainy, 15 years old, but it was something. The FBI's facial recognition software got no hits in criminal databases, but when they ran it through driver's license records across 11 western states, they found a possible match. A man named Thomas Pritchard, age 68, last known address in a rural area outside Spokane, Washington. Pritchard had no criminal record. He'd worked for the National Park Service from 1979 to 2003, stationed at various locations throughout the Northwest. He'd taken early retirement after what his file described as interpersonal difficulties with co-workers. Vague language that Torres later discovered meant multiple complaints about inappropriate behavior, boundary violations, and an incident where he'd led a family on what he claimed was a shortcut, resulting in them being lost overnight. That family had filed a formal complaint, but no charges had been pursued. After retirement, Pritchard had seemingly vanished from normal society. His last tax return was filed in 2005. His driver's license had expired in 2008. He owned 43 acres of isolated forest land, purchased in 1998. No mortgage, no active utilities in his name. The property was accessible only by a rough logging road, surrounded by thousands of acres of national forest. On August 3, 2024, a tactical team accompanied Torres and Reeves to Pritchard's property. They found a small cabin, well-maintained but primitive, with no electricity or running water. Solar panels provided minimal power. A creek ran through the property. It was the kind of place someone could live indefinitely without ever interacting with civilization. But Thomas Pritchard wasn't there. What they found instead was a library of maps, hundreds of them, covering every wilderness area in the Pacific Northwest. Many had hand-drawn annotations, routes marked in different colored inks, dates noted in margins. There were notebooks filled with observations about trail conditions, seasonal patterns, where search and rescue teams typically focused their efforts. It was a masterclass in wilderness navigation and, Torres realized with growing horror, in how to make people disappear. They also found photographs, not of victims, but of landscapes, remote canyons, hidden ravines, cliff faces, areas where someone could easily become trapped or lost. Each photograph was labeled with coordinates and notes about accessibility, visibility from air searches, and geological features. It was a catalogue of natural death traps. But most disturbing was a shelf containing 63 hiking permits, not filled out, just blank permits from various park services, some dating back decades. The implication was clear. Pritchard had been stealing permits, studying who would be on the trails, when and where. He'd been selecting his victims carefully, learning their routes, intercepting them with the perfect cover story. A laptop computer, old but functional, powered by solar charger, contained more files. Pritchard had been meticulous in his documentation. Though careful never to explicitly incriminate himself, he wrote about social experiments, about testing human decision-making under stress, about natural selection in modern humans who'd become too soft, too dependent on technology. It was the manifesto of someone who'd convinced himself he was conducting some kind of twisted research rather than causing deaths. The most chilling file was titled Successful Interventions. It contained 49 entries, each with dates, locations, and cryptic notes. October 2010 appeared with a reference to Group of 6, promising test case, curious to see group dynamics under pressure. There was no explicit admission of guilt, nothing that would hold up in court as a confession, but the implication was devastating. An immediate manhunt was launched. Pritchard's photograph was distributed to every law enforcement agency, park service, and media outlet in the western United States. The FBI offered a substantial reward for information leading to his capture. Emma went on every news program that would have her, holding up her parents' photograph next to Pritchard's image, asking anyone who'd seen him to come forward. But Thomas Pritchard knew the wilderness better than anyone searching for him. He'd spent 45 years learning every hidden corner, every cave, every abandoned mining tunnel. He'd prepared for this possibility, Torres realized. The cabin had been maintained, but not lived in recently. There was dust on surfaces, no fresh food, evidence that Pritchard hadn't been there in months, perhaps years. Weeks passed without a sighting. The search expanded to cover thousands of square miles. Trail cameras were installed at strategic locations. Park rangers were given special training to recognize Pritchard's methods of operation. But the wilderness is vast, and a man who knows how to hide in it can become invisible. Then, in late September 2024, a group of hikers in the North Cascades National Park reported an encounter with an older man who'd tried to convince them to explore an unmapped canyon. They'd declined, made uncomfortable by his insistence, and had the presence of mind to photograph him from a distance before quickly hiking back to the trailhead. The photograph matched Thomas Pritchard. A massive response team deployed within hours, but by the time they reached the location, Pritchard was gone. However, they found evidence he'd been camping nearby: a cold fire pit, some food wrappers, boot prints that matched the size and tread pattern from his cabin. He'd been living rough in the mountains, moving constantly, and apparently still trying to lure hikers off established trails, even while being hunted. The psychological profile Reeves developed painted a picture of a deeply disturbed individual who genuinely believed he was performing a service. Pritchard saw modern society as weak, saw people as disconnected from nature, and viewed himself as someone who tested their worthiness to survive. He'd rationalized his actions as natural selection, conveniently ignoring that he was manipulating circumstances to create deadly situations. In October 2024, on the 14th anniversary of the 6 hikers' disappearance, Emma organized a massive awareness campaign. Posters with Pritchard's face and description were placed at every trailhead in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. News helicopters flew over remote areas with thermal imaging equipment. The story dominated regional news for weeks. The pressure seemed to be working. Sightings became more frequent. Someone matching Pritchard's description was seen at a small general store near the Canadian border, purchasing supplies. 2 days later, he was spotted by a fire lookout tower operator moving through forest in an area that was supposed to be closed for the season. Each sighting gave searchers a general area to focus on, and the net was tightening. On November 7, 2024, a young couple hiking near Diablo Lake made a discovery that would finally end the manhunt. They found a body at the base of a steep embankment, partially concealed by fallen leaves and branches. The man had been dead for approximately 2 to 3 weeks, according to the medical examiner. He'd suffered massive trauma consistent with a fall from significant height. His identification confirmed what everyone had already suspected. Thomas Pritchard was dead. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved in the investigation. The man who'd spent years luring people into dangerous wilderness situations had ultimately died the same way, falling from a cliff in a remote area. Whether it was an accident, suicide, or some form of poetic justice, no one could say for certain. The ME ruled it accidental death, noting that Pritchard had been suffering from advanced stages of lung disease, possibly cancer, which might have contributed to dizziness or loss of balance. Detective Torres stood at the site where Pritchard's body had been found, looking up at the cliff face. It was remarkably similar to the canyon where the 6 hikers had died. Steep, treacherous, the kind of place where one wrong step could be fatal. She thought about karma, about cosmic justice, about whether the universe had a sense of irony. Mostly, she thought about the families who'd never get their day in court, never hear him explain why, never get the satisfaction of watching him face justice for what he'd done. Emma's reaction was more measured than people expected. In a statement released through her podcast, she wrote, "Thomas Pritchard's death doesn't bring my parents back. It doesn't erase 13 years of not knowing what happened to them. But it does mean he can't hurt anyone else. It means other families won't experience what mine did. And in that, there's a small, painful measure of peace." The FBI closed their investigation in December 2024, issuing a comprehensive report that detailed 49 cases they believed Pritchard had been involved in, either directly or indirectly. 17 had confirmed deaths, 23 remained missing persons cases, and 9 had survivors who'd managed to find their way back to safety after Pritchard's interventions. The report became required reading for law enforcement agencies dealing with wilderness disappearances. But the story still wasn't over. In January 2025, Torres received a package at her office. It had been mailed from a post office in Missoula, Montana, postmarked 3 days before Pritchard's estimated date of death. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note. "For when I'm gone, you deserve to understand." The USB drive contained video files, dozens of them, recorded on what appeared to be a handheld camera over many years. Pritchard had documented his experiments, not the actual encounters with hikers, but video diaries where he explained his philosophy, his methods, his rationale. Torres watched them with Reeves and representatives from the victims' families present. Pritchard spoke calmly, intellectually, as if discussing academic research rather than actions that had caused deaths. He talked about evolution, about how modern humans had lost their survival instincts, about his belief that he was helping restore natural selection. He showed maps, explained how he chose locations, detailed the psychological techniques he used to gain trust. It was comprehensive, methodical, and absolutely chilling. But in the final video, recorded just weeks before his death, something had changed. Pritchard looked exhausted, ill, and for the first time uncertain. "I'm dying," he said directly to the camera. "Lung cancer, probably from all those years of wildfire smoke, all that time breathing mountain air I thought was so pure. The irony isn't lost on me, and as I face my own death, I find myself questioning everything I believed." He paused, coughing, then continued. "I told myself I was teaching people, testing them, helping evolution along. But lately, lying awake at night, unable to breathe properly, I've been forced to confront the truth. I was just a bitter old man who resented other people's happiness. I saw families enjoying the wilderness together, couples laughing on trails, groups of friends supporting each other, and it made me angry because I had none of that. I was alone, and I wanted them to understand what isolation really meant." Tears appeared in his eyes. Whether from emotion or his illness, it was impossible to tell. "I can't bring them back. I can't undo what I've done. These videos are my confession, my admission that I was wrong, that I caused suffering for no good reason. I'm sending this to the detective because the families deserve to know the truth, all of it. They deserve to know that their loved ones died because of one bitter, damaged man who couldn't find meaning in his own life, so he tried to steal meaning from theirs." The video ended there. Torres sat in silence for several minutes after it finished playing. Emma, who'd insisted on watching, was crying quietly, her hands clenched into fists. The other family members showed various stages of grief, anger, and something that might have been relief. Relief at finally understanding, relief at having confirmation, relief that it was truly over. The FBI decided not to release the videos to the public, but excerpts were included in their final report. The full confession helped them close additional cases, identify remains that had been found but never connected to specific missing persons, and provide closure to families who'd been waiting decades for answers. In the months that followed, several interesting developments occurred. A journalist writing a book about the case discovered that Pritchard had kept journals dating back to the 1980s, stored in a safe deposit box at a bank in Spokane. The journals revealed that his behavior had started small, occasionally giving hikers wrong directions, recommending trails that were closed or dangerous, and escalated over 40 years into the systematic predation documented by the FBI. More importantly, the journals revealed why he'd started down this path. In 1979, Pritchard had been engaged to be married. His fiancée, an avid hiker named Claire, had died in a hiking accident in Yosemite National Park while Pritchard was working his first season as a park ranger. She'd fallen from a cliff while hiking alone, a tragic accident witnessed by other hikers who tried and failed to save her. The journals showed Pritchard's slow descent into twisted logic. He'd blamed himself for not being there to protect her. He'd blamed her for hiking alone. He'd eventually begun blaming all hikers for being careless, for taking the wilderness for granted, for treating dangerous terrain like an amusement park. His grief had curdled into rage, and rage had found expression in creating situations where he could vicariously experience the terror and helplessness he imagined Claire had felt in her final moments. It was a tragic origin story that explained but didn't excuse. Emma read the relevant portions of the journals and felt something unexpected. Pity, not forgiveness. She would never forgive the man who'd caused her parents' deaths, but a sad understanding of how pain, left untreated and unprocessed, could transform someone into a monster. By spring 2025, the memorial at Cascade Ridge had been expanded. 6 new plaques were added, honoring other victims connected to Pritchard's decades-long pattern of violence. The site became not just a memorial, but a symbol of resilience, of families refusing to let tragedy have the final word. Emma helped establish a foundation that provided grants for wilderness safety education, search and rescue equipment, and support services for families of missing persons. The Foundation's first project was installing a network of satellite emergency beacons along popular hiking trails in Oregon and Washington. Solar-powered stations where hikers could push a button and immediately alert search and rescue to their location. The system was named the Rivera Web Emergency Network, after Emma's parents and their friends. In the first 6 months of operation, it was used 14 times, potentially saving lives that might otherwise have been lost. Torres continued working on cold cases, but the Pritchard investigation had changed her. She'd seen how one damaged person could affect dozens of families, how the absence of answers could be more painful than the hardest truth, how closure, even imperfect, incomplete closure, could help people begin to heal. She became an advocate for better resources for investigating wilderness disappearances, for improved coordination between different jurisdictions, for taking seriously the patterns that emerge when you look at enough cases side by side. Special Agent Reeves used the Pritchard case as the basis for a training program teaching law enforcement officers how to recognize and investigate what she termed wilderness predation, criminals who exploit remote locations and people's trust in fellow outdoor enthusiasts. The program was adopted by federal agencies and several state police departments. As for Emma, she graduated with her degree in environmental science in May 2025. At her graduation ceremony, she wore 2 photographs pinned to her robe, her mother and father, smiling in their hiking gear, taken on a trail somewhere in the mountains they'd loved. She'd spent 22 years living in the shadow of their disappearance, but she'd transformed that shadow into light, using her pain as fuel to help others, to make the wilderness safer, to ensure their story meant something beyond just tragedy. On October 14, 2025, 15 years exactly since her parents had last been seen, Emma hiked the Cascade Ridge Trail alone, something she'd never done before. She followed the marked path for 3 miles, then stopped at the point where her parents had made the decision to trust a stranger, to leave the safety of the known trail for what they'd thought was an adventure. She stood there for a long time, looking at the forest stretching endlessly in all directions, thinking about choices and consequences, about how a single moment can redirect entire lives, about how the people we lose never really leave us. They become part of our landscape, shaping the terrain we walk through every day. Then she turned around and hiked back down the mountain, following the marked trail, and went home to continue the work of living, which is what her parents would have wanted, which is the only revenge worth taking against death. To refuse to stop living, to refuse to let tragedy define you, to transform loss into something that might prevent other losses, other families from experiencing the endless waiting, the unanswered questions, the 13 years of not knowing. The mountains still stand, indifferent and beautiful. Hikers still walk the trails, mostly safely, occasionally not. But now there are emergency beacons along the routes, better training for rangers, families who know to ask harder questions when strangers offer shortcuts, and a story that reminds everyone that the wilderness demands respect, vigilance, and the wisdom to know when something that seems helpful might be anything but. And somewhere in a sealed canyon beneath Cascade Ridge, 6 friends rest together, their story finally told. Their families finally able to grieve properly. Their deaths, though tragic and unfair, no longer a complete mystery, but a chapter in a larger story about human evil, human resilience, and the long, difficult journey from not knowing to understanding, to acceptance to, eventually, peace.